Hello everybody, hope you're all safe and doing great. So we all love to live a mental free life, mental good life, and also equality matters, justice matters, and that's what we are fighting for. So today we have someone really special in our place, so would like to warmly welcome Tyagi Ruan Patrana. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, so let me know how you are.
I'm okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we are up to start something really interesting and up to the date. So we'll ask my question. We'll start our question like this. So how do we define reparations?
So reparations, I mean the word itself, as you might have gathered, it's the act of repairing for some wrong that's been done to somebody. This reparations means the state or the person who's done the harm to you is working towards mending that harm. That's what reparations means.
All right. And what are the types of reparations? In fact, locally and also in internationally.
So internationally, reparations is something that they've been talking about for a very long time. You would have heard about reparations in the US they're talking about for the black people because of slavery and things like that. It's a concept that's also become a bit important in Sri Lanka, especially since after the war, the post-war situation, transitional justice and things like that. So here we're talking about how to repair harms that were done during the war or political violence or any kind of situation of unrest basically.
And also, who is eligible for these reparations? And also, as a country, we are living in Sri Lanka, there are our community divided into different so how it happens?
So at the moment, there's a office that's doing reparations. That's the government's official body. That's going to be the main body that's going to provide people reparations. But technically speaking, other bodies can also give reparations, and reparations, what the state recognizes as reparations and what victims expect as reparations sometimes are different, you know. So for example, the state would provide things like compensation, that's monetary, right? So it's based on, say for a death you would get a certain amount of money, if you've lost your limb you'll get some money. But the idea of reparations is actually much more broader. We talk about compensation, that's only one part of it. There's restitution, there's satisfaction, so many different elements that make up reparations, and to be able to say it's not going to happen again.
So I have noticed that fact sometimes people are quite afraid to talk about these reparations, and also they feel like quite shame to talk about it. So why this happens in current situations?
So sometimes it becomes a bit political, right? So because a part of reparations is also the perpetrators acknowledging what happened. Some things which are very uncomfortable to admit. And some people who've suffered these violence, they're also unwilling to accept that it happened to them publicly, because it can be sexual violence, it can be other forms of violence that's happened to them that's very private, that if you speak about it openly, they might be up for stigmatization. Their villagers might start, you know, treating them differently, gossiping, things like that. And there's also a lot of victim blaming. So it's like you asked for it and things like that. So because of these things, and also with the intention of moving on, they don't want a lot of people to know about what harms happen to them, especially when it comes to conflict-related sexual violence.
And also, what type of reparations do women request?
So women, like, it depends also on the harm that's happened, right? So the Center for Equality and Justice actually undertook quite a wide range of consultations with victims both in the north, east as well as the south. And there what came out was that they didn't necessarily say for example, I went through sexual abuse during the conflict, and because of that I want one thing. That's not what they wanted, and most of the time they didn't want compensation, because it was like, you can't place a monetary value on something that's happened to your dignity and your body.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So because of that, some people were like, make sure it doesn't happen again. Make sure that my children have access to good education, jobs. If my husband is not there, I would like pension. The possibility of me finding my own work, that's difficult because of the situation and especially the conflict. So because of that, give me good jobs that will pay. And the conflict situation is such that it's not one harm you go through, right? Sexual violence might be one thing that happened to you, but your husband or son might have disappeared. You might have been displaced from place to place. Your house might not be there anymore. You might have lost people you love. So there's a whole litany of harms that's happened to you. So because of that, a victim is unable to say, give me just this thing for this.
But
violence.
she lose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of it is about acknowledgement that, you know, if the perpetrators keep saying, no, this didn't happen to you, no, we didn't do anything, then you go back to the village and the village also believes them. It's like, no, you're making this up, you're lying. So then you're not in a bad situation, you're in a worse position. So those are so awareness raising and things like that, those are also the kind of reparations people ask for. It's not always, of course some people ask for truth and justice, people ask for compensation, but those are the very standard forms. And also access to justice is very difficult for victims, because sometimes the people we've spoken to, they said they've gone to the police station, but they refuse to take down the complaint because it could be a policeman or an army person, or even from a non-state actor like the LTT who's done it. So because of that, they don't record the complaint, and then you're back to square one. How do you even pursue justice? There's no access to justice. So it's a very difficult situation, yeah.
Quite helpless.
Yes.
Yeah, so as you mentioned acknowledgement, don't you think we should start this from acknowledgement through schools? Like children should know about this. What's your idea about that?
No, I think one of the key elements of reparation is non-recurrence. And that requires for the future generation and even our generation growing up, you must remember, our history education in schools was very limited.
Yes.
It went up to, well, in our time it was only up to 1948, and post-independence there was nothing. But I think now they go up till 1972, like up to the first constitution, and that's it. There's no mention of the JVP insurrection times, were both of them. There's no mention of the war in the north and the east, and there's a huge gap, a huge hole, where people have officially, there's no record of it in our textbook. So for us to be able to say never again, you first need to know what happened. So that needs to be taught. So our history curriculum needs to be expanded so that there is at least a grounding for us to start talking about these things, and then the perpetrators can start acknowledging it. Because right now there's only one narrative, and that's that it didn't happen.
So what do we mean by gender sensitive reparations?
So you can have reparations, you can have a policy that's on paper, except when you try and dole it out to people, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So sometimes gender sensitive reparations have to be taking into account a lot of the factors that affect women based on their experience. So for example, if you had an officer on reparations that required you to walk up with, say, your husband or family, and without any confidentiality disclose that you've been sexually violated, you've been sexually abused, that doesn't work. That's not gender sensitive, because these are so sensitive because of our culture and the level of stigmatization, that you need to make sure that the person who wants to report this feels comfortable in the way in which it's recorded. And that requires, you know, confidentiality, secrecy and things like that. So those are the elements that will make it a gender sensitive reparation. And for example, like even compensation, sometimes people say that if you give it in one lump sum, say your husband or your family member, they would come home drunk and take all that money away. So sometimes it's like it's up to the victim. So victim has to be at the center, where they're able to say what works for me is you pay me something every month, don't give me a lump sum. Or have a combination of the two. Initially give me a big amount at the beginning so I can start some livelihood support, and then you can give me the rest in different packages. So it has to be really tailored to individual circumstances, and that's why a rigid policy doesn't work. It has to be so flexible to be able to address the individual's needs.
So yeah, could you please explain the role of the office for these reparations?
So the Office on Reparations, it was something that was a part of the government's transitional justice package. This is the previous government's, and then there was an office that was set up, and their role is basically to be able to provide people reparations. So at the moment though, and they've just passed their policy as well, so they're starting their work. But my worry is that people tend to look at reparations as compensation. So it's not either or, you know. Just because you give compensation, people aren't satisfied. Some people take offense when they're offered money for the harms they've suffered. So you have to think about more broader ways of addressing it, like acknowledgements, like providing support for family and things like that. So that's something that the office should really work on now, so that people coming to them seeking reparations are satisfied. So yeah, the office is set up, it's working. They've had a few consultations. I think they can do far more, especially with women-specific reparations, compensation, like just to get an idea about what's expected of them.
Yeah, so lastly, do we have a policy on reparation?
Yeah, so the Office on Reparations, the act that set up the Office on Reparations, the act says that the Office on Reparations can basically formulate the policy, and that needs to unfortunately go through both the cabinet as well as parliament. We were hoping, as activists, we were hoping that the office itself would have the power to do that, so that it's depoliticized. It doesn't go through any of the political channels. They are an entity on its own that can come up with completely apolitical decisions about who gets reparations, how much they get, what type, quantum, form, all of that. So yeah, they've come up with the policy, and I hope they'll, you know, implement it very broadly.
What are the government institutional responsibilities for providing reparations?
So when a citizen has gone through a harm, it's generally either up to the perpetrator to provide some relief or redress, or it's up to the government. So when it comes to certain types of violence, for the perpetrator to provide compensation and things like that, that requires a court process. You have to go and for years fight it out in court, and that doesn't always happen. And some people are actually reluctant to go through the court system because they don't have a lot of faith in it. So because of that, the government, especially when it's gone through cycles of violence in its history, like there's a JVP insurrection, the first and the second, then there's the political violence, then there's a 30-year war. Those incidents have created a huge number of victims who've been either directly involved with the violence itself, or they are outsiders, they're just innocent bystanders. So the government has to, with the support of donors or anyone willing, be able to repair the harm that's been done to them. And that's what we call reparations, and that's why there's a government office that's been set up to provide reparations to victims.
And also, are there branches, offices of the office for these reparations?
So the act that set up the Office on Reparations provides that if the main office wants to, they can set up offices anywhere in the country. Although I'm not sure that this has been done so far. It's also the case that, there are district secretariats, DS offices, you say, around the country, and you can even use these existing mechanisms as a way of providing reparations. So that's one option as well. So you don't have to open an entirely new office as well.
All right. And also, how sensitive the government is when it comes to these issues?
I think, unfortunately, it's very backward thinking and very narrow. I remember when the office was being set up, there was a lot of debate about who should be the beneficiary, who would get compensation, who would be eligible for any kind of reparations through the office. Because there's a lot of back and forth, because most political parties are complicit in this violence. So they don't want the other side to get any kind of support from the state. But that's the wrong mentality. If we are going to leave the past in the past and move on, we need to acknowledge, we need to repair that harm so we can make sure it doesn't happen again.
And also, do you think the government sectors, these officials, have there enough much of knowledge and also resources to help the woman?
I mean, it's not just women also who need to be going through reparations, and basically they're not the only ones entitled to it, but women have suffered a different kind of violence, and in any situation, be it from a natural disaster to a situation of conflict, women bear the brunt of it. So there's a special type of reparation and needs of women in this whole process, but it's not to say men don't deserve reparations. Men do, and I think that's why you need to have a very holistic, broad way of approaching this. And yeah, that's why this office has to think about it. But this topic is kind of new. We've had different offices. There was an office called the Repia before that was only giving out monetary compensation for if you've lost a limb, or if you've lost your husband, they would provide compensation. So it's that narrow thinking that we need to move past it, and that's why the current government or anyone in government doesn't have that expertise. You need international best practices, you need technical support and things like that, which the international community, especially people who've been supporting these kind of processes, transitional justice processes in a lot of other countries. This is not something new to Sri Lanka. So only that happened in Sri Lanka. Other countries have gone through violence as well. So we can get that expertise to be able to best serve the victim.
And also, what are the steps and what are the relevant consequences that government or the state that should take to implement this gender sensitive reparations?
They need to listen. I think that's the first thing. I think there's this kind of, there's a tendency to think that, you pass something on paper, it's done. But there's no process of continuing consultation with people and victims who are the beneficiaries at the end of the day, and the people they're trying to serve, to see whether what they're providing is sufficient, is it satisfying them, is there anything more that can be done, is it too much, like is there a different form in which this can be done better. I think that ongoing conversation never happens, especially with government officers. It usually, unfortunately, ends up being a tick box exercise, and that's what we need to change, I think.
And with your experience, with your knowledge, why do you think that people are afraid and they feel so ashamed to talk about when something happens to women, and they take a step back when something that happened and they are blind, they are like they can't talk? What this happened?
it's a lot to do with cultural stigma and how say even sexual violence is seen in society today. It's ultimately a person who is bold enough and brave enough to come and tell their story, they end up being victimized even more. That shouldn't be the case. It should be the case that those people have support networks, those people have access to psychosocial support, compensation, court cases for those people who choose to go that route. Those things are not available to victims because they are busy being traumatized even more by their villages, by their families, by their communities. So I think awareness about these things plays a big role in this, so that society is not going to shun that person even more for what they've gone through.
Lastly but not least, how can local government officials support to the women accessing their reparations? Like, can you do some, like, explain some examples for that?
I think people aren't aware, firstly, what reparations is. And that's why programs like this is very important. And then the other thing is, there's not enough outreach. So people don't know that there's an office, that there are these programs by government that can support them. So they have to know that these schemes are available for them to apply or go to the office and get this support. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done on the grassroots level, where local government officers can reach out to victims or even communities, because there might be people who haven't identified themselves or publicly as victims. So about, it could be posters, it could be leaflets, it could be radio programs, just to let people know that it's what has happened to them is not okay, and the state is there to support them.
All right, so before ending the program, I would like to know, is there any other opinions that you have to share with our community?
I think reparations is like I said, it's something new. Unfortunately, I mean, it's been so many years since the end of the war. It's more than 10 years. And there are people who've been suffering since even before that, from the JVP times as well. And I think a lot of victims have not felt satisfied with what they've got from the state, because sometimes it's only money, and the money also changes. So somebody who was attacked during the Aludgama violence would have got something more than what somebody who got affected by the war got. So sometimes that discrepancy creates even more inequality and more hurt. And so that's why there has to be a very uniform process of treating these victims, so they don't feel like my life is worth less than somebody else's. So that's why I think the state has a huge responsibility there, and the state alone can't do this, because we're talking a lot of resources, and that's why we have to get support from the international community as well. And a lot of international members, Human Rights Council members, UN members, they talk about reparations. So we can ask them, now that you're asking us to do these things, support us. So we can get their support to at least try and repair some of the harm that's been done to these people.
Thank you so much, Tyagirwan Patirana. So I hope you guys, like right now, you are so impressed, because you need to know these things, and each and every word of this conversation might be so useful for your life. So we hope to see you again with something like this. Till that, stay safe.